My name is Oliver Rosales. I'm a professor of history at Bakersfield College, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this webinar today with Professor Eladio Bobadilla. And I just want to describe briefly the format for today before I introduce someone special who's going to introduce our speaker. So today's event will feature a guest talk, and the chat is open, as is the Q&A. So if at any point during the event today you want to ask a question, we'll have time at the end to do a moderated Q&A. The event is also being recorded, so I just want to let you know, that this will be archived on our grant webpage if you ever need to have access to it again. So this project today is being funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, specifically a grant entitled Energizing Humanities in California's San Joaquin Valley. Historically, the southern San Joaquin Valley has been an epicenter of labor and civil rights activism in California and beyond throughout the 20th century, stemming especially from the broad impact of the farm labor movement at both the state and national level. The region has also been a powerful landscape for literary production and narratives of self and place, as well as music and cultural performance. And so this grant project has brought together speakers from across the country who speak to these themes. And it's in that capacity that we're so excited to host Eladio Bobadilla. But first, I'd like to introduce Abel Guzman, who is the director for the Bakersfield College Rural Initiatives Program, who's going to formally introduce our speaker. Abel?
Thank you, Dr. Rosales, and welcome everyone. Good morning, happy Friday. Really excited to be here. I want to thank Dr. Rosales and Professor Bond for putting not just this talk together, but the entire conference this entire week. Really excited. This is a talk that's long overdue, literally, right? A little over a year ago, we were talking about holding this talk, and I think Dr. Bobadilla had already reserved his flight, and then we were just like waiting for the green light or the red light, right, from our respective states. And unfortunately, it was around the same week that we went into a full closure. And here we are a year later, and we're really excited. The initial talk was supposed to happen at our Delano campus, Bakersfield College Delano campus, which is located in the town that Dr. Bobadilla spent a good amount of his formative teenage years in, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about that. So thank you, Dr. Bobadilla, for being here today, and thank you everyone else for making it, whether you're here locally in Bakersfield or in Kern County or anywhere around the country. Thank you for joining us. So I want to start off with Dr. Bobadilla's official introduction here, and then I want to spend a minute or two just giving you my take on his introduction. So Dr. Bobadilla is a native of Delano. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of Kentucky. He completed his dissertation on the history of the modern immigrants' rights movement at Duke University in 2019 under the supervision of Dr. Nancy McLean. While at Duke, he received several major fellowships and grants, including the Gilder Lehrman Scholarly Fellowship, the Mellon Fellowship for Dissertation Research on Original Resources, the Otis Green Fellowship, a Bass Instructional Fellowship, the John Hyam Research Fellowship, and the George Pozzetta Dissertation Award. Previously, Dr. Bobadilla attended Weber State University and served in the United States Navy. He is an immigrant policy expert for the Scholar Strategy Network. So that's what you'll find on the flyer, on his LinkedIn and on websites. But I just want to take a minute here to give you a personal introduction. Dr. Bobadilla is a good friend of mine for over 20 years now. Grew up together, and I just am so proud of everything he's accomplished, and just is a pride of the community of Delano, a pride of our families, a pride of our friends, and just really putting Delano on the map. Really excited to see everything he's doing, and this is the introduction you'll see on my Facebook post when I'm bragging about Dr. Bobadilla, or as I refer to him, Eladio, my good friend, my brother Eladio. And so with that, Dr. Bobadilla, thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it off to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Abel, my good friend. And let me share my screen before I forget. Otherwise, I absolutely will forget. So let me do that and get this on. Can you all see it? Cool.
Yeah, we can
All
see
right,
it.
great. I'll start that in just a second. I guess we can do that. Well, thank you, Abel. So first, let me thank Professor Andrew Bond, and again, my dear friend Abel Guzman for this opportunity. And for the invitation to speak to those of you kind enough to join us today. I want to thank you all for being here as well, and for taking some time to hear a little bit about the history of our region, the history of our people. Of course, I would have much preferred to be there with you all in person. Delano is, as I'll mention in a minute, a very special place to me, and I know to many of you who are here. But the silver lining, I guess, of not being able to have this in person is that that we can all, or more of us can be here together, at least virtually. And I think we've all gotten pretty good at looking for and hopefully finding silver linings. So that's one of those silver linings, I suppose. And some of you know, this is, or was supposed to be, something of a homecoming for me. And that makes this talk something of a daunting task for me intellectually and emotionally. But I intend to keep the portion of this event that you hear me talking relatively brief. I'll blend a discussion of my educational path with some of the professional historical work that I do. And I'd like for this to be more of a conversation, in fact, than a talk. So I'll try to keep this brief. I'll try to say what I need to say, what I have to say, and then let folks, come into the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and I'll do my best to address those questions as they come. What else should I say before I jump into this? We were just talking in the previous discussion before we all joined in about kind of what our biographies or our own personal experiences do for us and for our students and for the communities that we teach and engage with. I'm not necessarily a fan of talking about myself. It's often difficult for me to do. I don't love to do it unless the situation calls for that. I will do that some of that here because I was asked to do it to kind of say a little bit about where I come from and why I do what I do, why I do it the way I do it. So I'll start there and then I'll move on to some of the larger implications of the work that I do. I know we're joined by farm workers, former and current, by labor organizers, educators, students, administrators, community leaders, and activists. And normally I can read the room a little bit, at least to get a sense of who's there. It's a little bit more difficult in this setting, but I know that all of those identities are represented here, and I thank you all for being a part of it. I hope that each of you finds something of value in this talk, and I think of this as being hopefully a generative rather than an exhaustive discussion. So please don't expect definitive answers or solutions to the social problems that I will address. Rather, please consider this an invitation to engage with the past and with the ongoing political and social challenges that our people of the Central Valley, especially farm workers and their families, continue to face. I should clarify that I'm not, strictly speaking, a native of Delano, California, or of the Central Valley. I was born in Mexico, and I came to the States at the age of 11 without documents. But I do consider Delano my home. It is here that I grew up, that I developed a social and political consciousness, and it is here that my journey and work began. So before I tell you a little bit about what I do professionally and why Delano is so important to that work, I want to tell you how I came to that work. When we moved to the States, to Delano, I had tons of dreams. My parents were farm workers. They worked from sun up until sundown in the blistering heat of the Central California sun to feed me, clothe me, and provide me a better life than they had. Don't get me wrong. I always understood that the work of the fields was dignified, even beautiful. My parents taught me that early on, and not just my parents, but everyone I knew who worked in the fields. They also taught me that it was hard work. It was difficult work, backbreaking work, poorly paid work, underappreciated work. And so they wanted better for me. So I worked hard, I guess, in a relative sense, not nearly as hard as my parents or farm workers that you all know. But as a child, I tried to work hard. I learned English mostly through, as Abel knows, watching The Simpsons. I still have, so you can still tell that I'm a big Simpsons fan. I tried to do well in school. I helped my parents by earning money whenever I could in the summers. And I have to say that it didn't bother me much at the time to be undocumented. As one person I interviewed for my dissertation told me, who needs papers when you're a kid? I think that was true then, at least for some of us, some of the time. I think, though, that the cruel and horrific images that have surfaced in recent years of migrant children in cages, of migrant children being ripped from their parents' arms, complicate that narrative today. I don't think it's true anymore. I'm much more careful about saying things like that now, or taking that kind of comment at face value. I think it was true for me. I think it was true for a lot of younger undocumented people. When you're young, you don't realize you're undocumented, or you know, but don't really know what that means. Again, I think today it's more difficult to make that kind of claim when we see images like this. But at the time, it seemed real to me. It seemed that this was my experience. I didn't really know the difference. I didn't know what being undocumented really meant in a tangible sense. At least until about my junior year of high school. It was then that my friends began to talk about college, to visit college campuses. And Abel, you'll remember our visit to UC Santa Cruz, and where we wondered why everyone was so gloomy. That's not to throw shade at UC Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz has enough shade on its own. But this was an exciting moment, right, for so many of my friends, and I was so happy for them. At the same time, I think it was then that I realized what being undocumented actually meant for me. My parents were poor and couldn't afford to send me to school, and without papers, financial aid was really not an option. So amid despair, anger, frustration, sadness, all of these emotions, I sort of gave up. While I had been a straight A student, I began to skip school, to fail classes, to hang out with the wrong people. My family noticed it, and so did my teachers. I'll never forget one time when I walked into a math class and there was a test. I didn't know about the test because I hadn't been going to class. Of course, I got an F, although the teacher marked it with an F minus, minus, minus. I'll always remember that. There's 3 minuses. And he wrote on this test that I was, quote, finally living up to my potential. I know there are teachers here today. Teachers, folks, please don't do this. I also know that there are teachers here, and most of you are terrific. And I also remember you. I also remember the tremendous teachers, the good teachers who took me under their wing, who showed me that I was capable of doing hard things. Be those kinds of teachers, please. Remember both. I certainly remember both of these extremes, and I'm grateful for all the good teachers that I had. But at this moment, my confidence was totally wrecked. I didn't feel like I had a future. And I think it was then, ironically, that I began to accept that I wouldn't go to college, that I would work in the fields like my parents. So I say ironically because I think this is when I decided that I needed to finish high school, at least. I wasn't on track to graduate high school after about my junior year, so I was ready to drop out. But I began to think, my parents worked so hard for me. They have worked their entire lives to give me a dignified future. What kind of message am I sending to them if I just give up and drop out? They had never gone to school. They didn't have any formal education, not even a primary education. So I felt like I owed it to them to at least finish high school. There was no shame, I want to make clear, about the idea of working in the fields or working in other industries. But I did want to graduate high school. I wanted to make sure that at least I gave my parents that much. I owed it to them. So I did. I took weekend classes, after school classes, made up lost credits through the immigrant program. And I managed just barely somehow to graduate. I think my GPA in the end was like a 2.1. And I still have that diploma or that transcript somewhere, because I often have conversations about this kind of thing with my students. And I think it's helpful for them to see that history in someone else. It was then that I got a miraculous gift, though, right after I graduated high school. I got a work permit and then a green card. And as soon as I got it, the first thing I did was join the military so that I could pay for college. So I left for boot camp in November 2005 and graduated in January of the following year. I then attended apprenticeship school in Mississippi and was stationed in San Diego. There, I became a US citizen, I met my wife, and I served overseas. I was honorably discharged in 2009. I wanted to achieve my dream of attending college after that, and with the GI Bill, I could finally afford to do it. But who would take me, right? A 2.1 GPA near dropout. Well, it turns out that a little college in Utah, Weber State University, was happy to take me. See, Weber State is an open enrollment university, something that I didn't even know existed. And this is one of the reasons I'm deeply passionate about open enrollment schools, period, whether universities or community colleges. Community college is always an option for me, but the GI Bill has all sorts of bureaucracy that makes it difficult to work with community colleges. So I found this university that was open enrollment, and there I could start over. My record, literally a blank slate. That was a liberating and exhilarating experience. No one cared there that I had barely graduated high school, that I had been a total screw up, that I was poor, that I was first generation. So it was in the least likely of places that I found a way to embark on my dreams. And I managed to graduate in 3 years. And then I began graduate school in 2013 at Duke University. Normally I'd hype up, the basketball program. It is March, but this year I was terribly disappointed. I can't even hype up my current institution because they're out too. So I'm left just sort of not being able to do that. I'm sorry. Anyway, I finished my PhD in 2019. And with my elderly and now retired farm worker parents by my side, this is at Weber State, this is at Duke, I was able to celebrate becoming a PhD. So now that you know sort of where I come from, I want to move on to explain why that matters in terms of my work. It was in graduate school that I began to think about this history, my history, your history, our history. Having grown up on the west side of Delano, home of the farm workers movement, just about a mile from the 40 acres compound where so much of the movement's drama played out, I had questions about it. Specifically, I wondered why I didn't know anybody who was a member of the Farm Workers Union. My parents were farm workers. Most of my friends' parents were farm workers or had been at some point. Most of the people I knew had some connection to farm labor, and yet I didn't know a single soul who was a member of the union. Why? Part of the answer became clear as soon as I began doing research. As I sat in the archives of the United Farm Workers records in Detroit, an answer, at least a partial one, began to emerge. It was the UFW's treatment of the undocumented that alienated them. You see, while the union insists that they have been, quote, longtime advocates for immigrants' rights, the truth is a little bit more complicated. Cesar Chavez and his union initially resisted including the undocumented in their movement and often went beyond that. Concerned that undocumented workers were, quote, playing an instrumental role in breaking the strikes, in 1973, the union went as far as creating its own border patrol, the so-called wet line, to patrol the US-Mexico border near Yuma, Arizona. I want to say a couple of things about this. First, that a number of scholars and journalists have done tremendous work on this. This is by no means an original claim or argument or story that I'm telling you. Folks like Matt Garcia, Frank Bardicke, and Miriam Powell, who I think is here joining us, have written extensively about this in complex and important ways, and I invite you to read their work. It will really elucidate what this was, where it really came from, how it played out. What I will say about it is that there was a logic to this. You know, it's easy to look back now and sort of condemn the union and demonize, right, this move. I've often been tempted to do that, and some of my writing has evolved over the years on this. But there was a logic to it, right? The untrained guards not only reported immigrants to Border Patrol, but often took matters into their own hands, harassing and sometimes beating them. As one immigrant I interviewed told me, quote, "They would hurt you, they would fuck you up." Here in Delano too, union investigators went to great lengths to identify, sometimes harass, and often turn over undocumented people to immigration authorities. Again, in fairness to the union, there was a logic to its efforts. The presence of large numbers of undocumented people at times did prove disastrous to its organizing efforts. And employers knew that. With a seemingly unlimited supply of cheap labor, employers had little incentive to engage in good faith negotiations. The availability of that cheap, docile, and frankly scared labor force, or at least imagined to be this way, served the interest of capital, who could use Mexican strikebreakers to cripple the efforts of farm workers in California, predominantly, but not exclusively, Mexican Americans. And I think of the historian Jacqueline Hall's words here that remembering is always a form of forgetting. I think it's important not to forget that the movement was begun not by Mexican Americans, not by Cesar Chavez, but by Filipino farm workers, whose stories have for too long been forgotten, ignored, and footnoted. Now, the UFW wasn't alone in pursuing this logic either. It wasn't like this was a novel position that only the UFW took. Other unions similarly have rejected the undocumented, and ordinary Mexican Americans often did too. And they had been complaining about what they called hordes of wetbacks that were taking over the job market, making it difficult for American-born ethnic Mexicans to find jobs, to make decent wages, or for that matter, to assimilate. As one report from the 1960s and 70s put it, Mexican Americans, quote, bitterly resented the intrusion of the illegals. And this goes back quite a bit farther. This didn't start in the 1960s. In 1954, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the deportation of over 1 million ethnic Mexicans amid an economic downturn, Mexican American leaders and organizations like the American GA Forum and the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, enthusiastically supported the move, decrying the so-called invasion of the so-called whitebacks. Here you see an image from those mass deportations. And here you see a pamphlet or booklet from 1953 called What Price Whitebacks that sought to make this argument that undocumented people were making life difficult for Mexican Americans, that they should be pushed out, that they were a threat, that they were a health danger, that there were all of these horrible things. If you read this pamphlet today and didn't know where it came from, you might be tempted to think that it was, a white supremacist group, that it was the Klan who wrote this. It was harsh, extremely harsh, but it came from a Mexican American organization and from its labor allies in Texas. Now, this did eventually change, but it changed only because of activists. None more important, back up here, none more important than Bert Corona. Corona was not the first, though, to argue for working class solidarity among ethnic Latinos, both US-born and immigrant. The Guatemalan activist Lisa Moreno back in the 1930s, when it was deeply unpopular to do so, urged people of conscience, Black, brown, white, to reject what she called a complete system of intimidation and discrimination against foreign-born workers. Bert Corona then took these lessons and extended them, building a transnational class and race-conscious movement that saw Mexican Americans, immigrants, and other working-class people as he put it, one people without borders. Going beyond simplistic answers, as he often said, Corona worked to foster ties among Mexican American and Mexican immigrant folks, to educate the American public about the ways in which discrimination and intra-ethnic division served the interests of capitalists and hurt all workers, and crucially, to convince reticent Mexican Americans like Cesar Chavez that the long-established pattern of exclusion of immigrants could no longer be supported, either ethically or strategically. You have to remember, in the 1970s, the labor force in the fields was largely immigrant and largely undocumented. So for the union to reject those workers was essentially to reject the people it was supposed to represent. And Bert Corona pointed this out repeatedly. This doesn't make sense. Right? Bert Corona and many others, but none more vocally than Bert Corona. We understood Cesar's frustration, Corona said, but then he also urged them to organize and to welcome the undocumented into the union. He remembered some of Cesar's people didn't appreciate our position, but Corona and others pushed on. As another activist, Peter Camejo, told Chavez, let us not ignore our brothers and sisters. They should be part of the working class, or they are part of the working class. They should be part of our movement. These activists, which I should say also included Mark Day, who I think might be here, and who co-drafted the Immigrants' Bill of Rights, or as its official title called it, a Charter of Rights for Immigrant Workers, and who hasn't received nearly enough credit for his work on this issue, said he can't. Corona kept the pressure up, and vocally, loudly, and publicly urged Chavez to focus instead on whom he called the real enemy. And in large part, because of this work, Chavez abandoned his anti-immigrant stance, leading the Farm Workers Union to shift its position by about 1975 in what Chavez called a shift that happened, as he put it, I think, in the heat of the struggle. And eventually the UFW did become a leading force for immigrants' rights. Let's remember that Dolores Huerta, since the movement's peak through the present, has become a vocal advocate for immigrants' rights, among other things, leading a door-to-door campaign in 1994 to fight against Proposition 187. But it was also immigrants themselves who prompted this change. Immigrants resisted border and immigration enforcement and social control, repeatedly violating the irrational line that separated working class people from on both sides, and often outsmarting the immigration control regime that operated not just in the border or near the border, but in the valley too, hundreds of miles from the border. In those days, Eliseo Murillo, a Delano farm worker, told me, La Migra gave us good scares. We saw immigration daily. We'd be in the fields in Arvin, and at night we slept under the vineyards because immigration showed up at the camps at night. So to avoid deportation and harassment, immigrant workers looked out for one another. They opened their homes to fellow immigrants. They built alert networks to warn one another about raids. And in some cases, they even gave up part of their wages to create a deportation fund in order to ensure that those who've been deported could come back quickly, sometimes within a day or two. This is one of my favorite stories. This didn't happen in Delano, but it was farm workers. And I forget exactly where, so I won't give you the wrong information, but this was in the Southwest. There was this group of farm workers who routinely were deported. It became so routine that about once a week, the immigration patrol started showing up at the fields and grabbing as many people as they could. Except the Border Patrol officers hated doing this because this place where they went to conduct these raids was extremely muddy and dirty, and they hated getting their uniforms, their crisp green uniforms, dirty. So they started to work out a deal, these farm workers and the Border Patrol officers. They'd come once a week for their quote unquote raid. And then the group of farm workers would volunteer, one or two people would volunteer themselves, get themselves deported so that they could claim to have done their job. And then those left behind would give up a small portion of their paycheck, pull it together, send it to those south of the border who had been deported so that they could come back. And then new people would rotate in this way. This was kind of a creative and ingenious way to deal with immigration control. By no means the most typical way of doing it, but it's one of my favorite stories from the archives. Despite the obstacles in the way of these immigrants, they sometimes also organized into unions, went on strike, and fought back against employers' abuses and for better wages and more dignified and safer working conditions. I think the way that immigrants looked out for one another, the way that they learned to speak for themselves, to fight back, hell, just to survive. As much as I'm an advocate, for higher education, for formal higher education, these are what I call the lessons of the fields. This is the education of the fields, the kind of thing you never learn in a classroom. Our communities continue to be forgotten, attacked, harassed, scapegoated, and exploited. But we're still here. Borrowing those words from a man I deeply love and admired, Mr. Abel Guzman, Sr., the beloved father of my dear friend Abel Guzman. He passed away in 2019 after a long health battle. But a few years ago, when I interviewed him for my dissertation, the man was full of life, even as it was obvious that his health was declining. He was so proud of his children, and that pride was palpable, when you could literally see it and feel it. He'd been a farm worker himself too, though he eventually went to barber school and started his own business. But he told me during that interview, aquí estamos todavía. We're still here. And I think he meant a lot of things. As an oral historian, you get pretty good at reading through the layers of meaning in the words of your narrators. And I think, of course, on the most literal and superficial level, he meant that he was still here, that despite his illness, he was continuing to fight. He mentioned to me how grateful he was to be a U.S. citizen, where, for whatever its faults, this country had allowed him to live a longer and fuller life, to see his children grow up and go to college and become exceptional young men and women. But I also think he meant something else, that as a community, we're still here. That despite the attempts of authorities, governments, nativists, and exploiters who want to see us beaten and erased, we have not gone away. We're making this country browner, prouder, and more just. We're fighting to take lessons of the fields out of Delano and to bring new lessons back. We're educating ourselves and our communities. We're fighting to bring to fruition the dreams of our fathers and our mothers. So we've not gone away. We will not go away. We're still here, and we'll always be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eladio. So I'll give you a moment there. I apologize, Eladio. I did hear you say thank you. Does that conclude the formal presentation? We're ready for dialogue?
Yeah, let's
Okay.
chat. Let's have a conversation.
Okay, well, one thing I was hoping to do, and I'm hoping Andrew can help me out here. I saw several questions coming in the Q&A and dialogue, and I want to ask you one that was there, but also we have some great scholars in the room. Like I'm so impressed by the people who are here today. So if you do want to raise your hand, my colleague Andrew can unmute you so you can ask your question. But I just want to ask one question that came up earlier. Eladio, could you talk a little bit about the scholars, the historiography a little bit that you referenced in terms of folks who are writing about the United Farm Workers vis-a-vis undocumented immigrants?
Sure. Yeah. So in, I think it was my first year in graduate school, 2013, 2014, I took a class with Zaragoza Vargas at UNC, Chapel Hill. And in that class, we discussed Matt Garcia's From the Jaws of Victory. I think it had come out fairly recently at that time. It was something of a shock. I mean, it really shook us, those of us who took the class. I was new to graduate school. I still didn't know anything, right? I knew what I knew, and what I knew was my experience in Delano. And in Delano, we hold Cesar Chavez rightfully, I think, for the most part, as an icon, as kind of a patron saint of the people of Delano, people of Central Valley, farm workers more generally. So it was actually really hard to read about this history that was ugly, that was difficult to grasp, that was controversial, of a Cesar Chavez who was complicated, who wasn't a saint, who was nuanced human being with human moments and human impulses. I think that was the most kind of formative text. Of course, Frank Bardacke wrote more about that as someone who had been in the movement. Marshall Gans, of course, as well, pointed out to some of the things that broke apart the movement. Miriam Powell, who's written about the wet line, among many other things. And I think what that has done is complicate that narrative. And I think it's necessary. It's painful, but it's necessary. It's painful because we want to think of our leaders, forefathers, those who came before us, those we hold up as heroes, exactly as that, as heroes, as people who were not that complicated, who just sacrificed and did these amazing things, and who were, one thing, and they weren't. And that's okay. We need to learn those lessons, the lessons of the 1960s and 70s, to understand what went wrong, to understand what happened to the movement, to understand the ongoing struggles. I think one of the largest lessons we can take is that the movement didn't end in the 1970s, that it really was a beginning, that we're still fighting these battles, we're still struggling. And we have to kind of grapple with some of the complicated history of the United Farm Workers, the farm workers movement generally, or as I do with immigrants' rights more broadly. I'd like to imagine a history of Mexican Americans who were always by the side of immigrants, but that's just not reality. That's not how the past actually happened. And if we ignore those lessons, then we really don't have a place to start today.
Thank you, Eladio. We see a question in the chat from Tim Monreal, professor at CSU Bakersfield. He writes, now that you are in Kentucky, a part of what many folks continue to call the new Latinx South because of the rapidly growing Latinx populations there, I am wondering what similarities and differences you are seeing amongst Latinx laborers and organizers between the Central Valley and rural areas of the South.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's fundamentally different, right? The South is a different landscape in terms of labor struggles, certainly. Delano and the Central Valley in general is much browner than where I am now. So it looks different, right? Those struggles look different. Communities here are unfortunately still quite segregated, siloed. But there are also similarities in the sense that these farm workers are not docile. They're not sitting back and taking abuses. They're organizing. They have been for decades. It's not new to them. There's a great deal of work on that, on the kinds of labor struggles that have taken place through the 20th century and the present in the South. So in that sense, workers understand that they have to fight back, that they have to unionize, that they have to come together. The larger kind of landscape here is definitely different, but it's vibrant, right? It's growing. It's a growing community. You see the richness in those communities everywhere you go. One of my favorite places to visit here in Lexington is this area of town that I was telling folks about before we gathered in this meeting. In the previous meeting, I was mentioning how Lexington, where I live at the University of Kentucky, is we have this region that some folks called Mexington, full of culture. It's not just Mexicans, but it's largely Mexicans, and so it's full of Mexican food, art, sounds, right? It sounds Mexican. It sounds like the Valley. So for me, it's like a little piece of home to kind of drive down to that side of town and recognize and feel and remember that, yeah, in fact, this is an exciting place for Latino history. It's a place that's changing the region and making it, like the rest of the country, again, browner and more diverse.
Well, I hope, Eladio, that you and Tim can connect at some point, because Tim has an interesting connection of being from the Central Valley and going to the South and then returning. But we actually see Ramon Martinez has his hand up. Can we unmute him, Andrew, or do I need to do that?
You got to make me co-host so I can unmute people.
Okay, I think I can do it. Allow to talk. Ramon, are you there?
Yeah, that's it.
Ramon, are you there? Go ahead,
Yes.
Ramon.
Hi, greetings from San Jose, California, from two guys from Bakersfield.
No, from Delano.
Oh, I'm a Delano. We have two questions. My one question is, President Obrador from Mexico last week in the New York Times said he was going to ask Biden for a new guest worker program. What are your thoughts? Because you haven't mentioned these struggles in the past were about two kinds of immigration, legal guest workers and people who came on their own. And then he
you're absolutely right. Thank you for that comment and question. Yeah, I mean, the farm workers movement of the Valley of the 60s and 70s, the Central Valley, could not have happened without the termination of the Bracero program that brought millions of exploitable and deportable migrant workers from Mexico, with large numbers of, again, as you say, not just undocumented, but also so-called guest worker, braceros. The farm labor union and the farm workers movement generally could not have even taken a stand. So while I think it's always dangerous for historians to speculate about the future, I think we have enough lessons to suggest that that would be disastrous. Guest workers are routinely and regularly abused and exploited, as braceros were for decades, from the 1940s to the 60s. And that also makes organizing here north of the border impossible. So I think this is one more way in which, for a lot of us, the policies of the Mexican president have been a huge disappointment. And I think it would be absolutely disastrous for workers to have a new guest worker program. I can't see anything good coming out of that, frankly.
Thank you, Eladio. Let me see. I see a question from Miriam Paul in the chat. So
if I could please, I was with Ramon, hate to interrupt. I just want to.
I apologize. Go ahead.
I'm done. I'm sorry too. Professor Bobadilla, did you grow up across the street from the Frastos in Delano?
Can you tell me where that was, more or less?
The corner of Asti and 8th, I think it was.
I grew up over by 12th Street. So I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. I thought maybe you did, because I grew up in Delano. I went to high school with all the Chavez kids, the older ones.
Yeah.
And of course, the experience was very profound, and it stays with me to this day. My area, my question for you is: you mentioned the difficulties you had living the migrant lifestyle, but my question is: do you have any insights into how it impacted the kids that were from here already, U.S. citizens? For example, the Chavez kids. I went to high school with the Chavez kids, and you could see the strain and the stress, being called names and harassed, that they had to go through. I myself was ostracized sometimes because I hung out with the Chavez kids. So something about how that impacted the young people that were from here all along.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean, when you say Chavez kids, do you mean I'm not entirely sure I understand the question.
ask again.
The psychological effects on the kids who grew up in the struggle, the Chavez children, for example.
Oh, I see.
You could see the strain and the stress, being called names, threatened, and harassed.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to speak for them. Certainly, I can imagine that was a stressful and anxious-filled experience for them. I think that's a little bit beyond my expertise. So I'd hate to speak about them, but I'm sure it was difficult. I'm sure it was a troubling position to be in.
Yeah, I did want to go back to the Q&A. There were some other questions floating in there, and I do appreciate Ramon's question as well. We had some of the Chavez Foundation folks on panels earlier this week, and we will be archiving all that footage if you want to go back and see it. But let me see. Miriam Paul asked a question in the chat. Andrew, do you see that? There's a lot of action in the chat, and I might have missed it.
She asked a question. She might have posted it too in the chat, in the Q&A box.
The Q&A box. Oh, I see it. Yeah. Could you talk a little, Eladio, about your sense of conditions in the fields around Delano today? What's happening? What needs to happen?
Sure. Yeah, I should say that I've been away from Delano for a long time now. my experience, what I know about the fields comes from my parents who were farm workers until recently, from the people that I know. In some ways, the conditions are worse than they were in the 60s and 70s. When you start looking at pay, for example, and you adjust for inflation, what many farm workers make today really is less than they were making at the height of the movement, which had made tremendous strides by the early 70s. On the other hand, it's difficult to overstate the importance of some of the tangible changes that happen in the fields because of the work of Cesar Chavez and many others, right? It wasn't just Chavez who led the movement. Things like water, like being able to drink water in the fields as they're working, being able to take bathroom breaks. Those things have made a huge difference for farm workers, and it's tangible. So it's complicated, right? And I hate to say that phrase because we historians love to say it, but it is complicated. The legacy is mixed. I will say that there are still things that I remember, and I'd like to think not like too old, but just in the early 2000s, my parents, when they were still working in the fields, they have to bring home the trays that they used to collect the grapes in, pick the grapes into. And I've been thinking about this a lot for some reason, struggling with this. But they would, they'd have to bring those home and clean them on their off time. This would take like hours sometimes. There were a bunch of tons of trays, and they'd ask me to help. And I've been grappling with a lot of guilt about, when you're a kid and you're grumpy about being asked to do things. I wish I could go back and do that for them, and be grateful that I got to help them in some way. But it's that kind of thing, right? That still, when I think back, it bothers me so much that they were being asked on their like one day off to go and do work at home that wasn't paid. So in some ways, this is still a tremendous struggle for workers in terms of pay. As I mentioned, it's in some ways worse. Full-time farm workers can expect to make, if they're lucky, about $30,000 a year, maybe a little more, but that's full-time year-round work, and most farm workers don't work full-time year-round. So really, realistically, they're making $17,000, $18,000 a year. 60% lower than the annual average wage for full-time workers in California. So the struggle continues. Some of the ways in which conditions in the fields have changed is positive, but it's still a deeply exploitative, difficult type of work, and farm workers continue to struggle with having their voices heard and their rights respected.
Yeah, there's been some other questions coming into the chat, but before we go there, Eladio, I want to piggyback on Miriam's question. So I would argue that some of the things that need to happen in farm worker communities is that they need to learn the history, right? Warts and all, just as you're describing, and not just have triumphant versions. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your work with Max Krochmal's Black and Brown Oral History Project? Because oral history, Rob, can be this intervention that we all do, universities, colleges, high schools, et cetera, to kind of put kids in contact with that history. Could you talk a little bit about that experience, and was it formative? How did it drive your work, and what are some potentials for the future?
Yeah, 2016, I worked with Max Krochmal and Todd Moy, who I think I saw his name here. I hope you're here, Todd. That was a fantastic experience. Really shaped the way I thought about my own work, about historical work generally. We talked to ordinary people in Texas. This was all in Texas. I'd love to see a project like this, happen elsewhere. And there are other projects that are doing similar things in California. So I'm happy to see those, but we need more of it, because so much of what we, grew up reading, hearing, are histories of big names and big figures, and that's necessary, right? The history of Cesar Chavez is necessary. The history, the complex history of the movement is necessary, but it's also important to hear the voices of ordinary farm workers. If we want to learn what's going on in the fields, right? That's how we do it. We talk to them, we interview them, we ask them about their life experiences, we get the lessons that they've learned. We understand their struggles and their victories, and to make sense of of what's happening in the fields, we have to talk to farm workers. Thankfully, that's easier now than it ever has been, right? And so I encourage, for example, high school teachers, college professors, anyone who teaches or who is involved with young people to encourage them to get their stories of their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors. Grab a phone, right, and interview someone, an elder. Ask them about their life, their struggles, their victories. Ask them who they are, and learn those lessons. Right, it's really easy, and it yields so much. Right, and often people, when you start asking them questions, will tell you, I don't have a story that anybody would want to hear, and they're always wrong, because they're always the best people to talk to. When people, people are humble, especially farm workers are humble. They don't think that books should be written about them, but you know what? They should be. And I think they recognize that eventually. When they start talking about their histories and they recognize that their stories matter and that their stories are worth telling, then not only do we learn lessons, but those communities also learn that they matter.
Thank you, Eladio. Let's maybe return to the chat. I thought there was a really wonderful question from Nancy Jimenez, maybe circling back to the earlier part of your talk, talking about your educational upbringing. She says, what advice do you have for local Delano, Early Mart, immigrant children and young adults? Being able to look past poverty and dire conditions can be extremely difficult. So what advice would you have for young folks?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think when you grow up in poverty, when you grow up seeing nothing but despair and hard work and struggle, it's difficult to see past. This is one of the reasons that I do, despite the awkwardness of it all, like to kind of tell my own story, because this is exactly how I felt for a long time. You can make it out, right? You can do great things, but that also requires community, right? I'm not someone who believes that, if you just put your mind to it, you can do anything on your own. No one does anything on their own, right? We all do it because there's someone at some point who believed in us, who helped, gave us a helping hand, who taught us, right? The fact that someone taught me that there was such a thing as the GI Bill, that there was such a thing as open enrollment universities. Without that knowledge, I couldn't have done anything. The fact that someone at some point gave me a hand. I have that and many other bad memories that I mentioned of my time in high school. But I also remember going to a guidance counselor at DHS who looked at my transcript and saw that I had failed not just math but also physical education, because I just wasn't going. And she said, "You know what? It doesn't impress me that you failed PE. And so why should I, give you these classes that you want?" And specifically, I was asking for the newspaper class. I really love to write. I told her, I said, "It's the only thing I'm good at. Like, it's what I love, and I'm good at it." And she just stopped and looked at me, and I think she said something just like, "All right," and just put me right, gave me that chance to do something that I loved and that I appreciated and that I was good at and that I could be nurtured in. And that alone, right, that makes a huge difference. So I guess advice for young students is don't give up, of course. Don't let the despair take over you, but find your people. Find people who are willing to help you. Find people who are willing to show you that kindness, right? And rely on those people who genuinely care for you.
Thank you, Eladio. Another question from Dana Hines-Gelder, who I know is an anthropologist and has done some interesting work on Mexican immigration in the Delano area with some of her colleagues. She says, about 5 to 7 years ago, I had read that OSHA in Northern California was active within the protection of immigrant women in the fields. Can you speak to any current activities in this regard? Thanks. And again, I think I would even add on that, like in your dissertation and now your book project, how do the stories of women figure in?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm afraid I don't know too much about the specifics of what was happening in Northern California with OSHA. So I'd hate to just speculate on something I don't know much about. But I will say, and I hope you'll forgive me for kind of taking this into a broader question. Oliver, thank you for kind of allowing me to do that. But the history of women in and out of the fields is critical to immigration history. And, again, until very recently, we just didn't hear the voices of women. We pretended like immigration was this male thing, that men migrated, women stayed home. And that has not always been the case. In fact, that's never really been the case. Most migrant farm workers have been men, but especially since the 80s, women started to come, sometimes with families, sometimes without, sometimes on their own. Sometimes they were the breadwinners who sent money back to their kids and even their husbands back home. There's some of the interviews I've done with women tell me about the way that those gender roles changed when they came to the States. For the most part, it was expected in Mexico, or sometimes for those who came from Central America, that, as one person put it, men in the fields, women at home. Well, what happens when these families move to the US? That just isn't tenable anymore. It doesn't work. Even if men want to do that, even if men want to have that kind of relationship and that kind of family, it doesn't work. The economics don't work. Women work, right? Women have to bring in money. That, on the one hand, ensures that women are doing this very difficult, backbreaking work that sometimes they were not used to doing, but that they prove just as capable of doing. But at the same time, that they earn the respect, the money, the status of independent people who can make their own decisions. So as more and more women have moved into the fields, we've seen the kind of feminization of field work, and at the same time, the empowerment of women who are now making their own decisions, making their own money, and really participating in what is a difficult, economy and industry, but participating in it as fully as the men.
Yeah, thank you. We still have a few more questions in the chat. And again, I would just reiterate to anybody who's in the audience, feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to hear your voices. But looks like we have a question. This is a really interesting question from Liz Robinson. She says, "Hi, Eladio. As you know, I'm a literature student of French, so I'm not super familiar with your field and therefore don't know the literature or fiction about your field. Would you have any recommendations for literary works to read?"
Yes. Hi, Liz. I'm glad you made it. I'll send you a bunch of, let me think about them and then send you a bunch. But I should say that we were just speaking with Professor Elena Viramontes earlier. So look up her work and read everything she's ever written and start there. But we can talk more about some other works of fiction. Thanks for the question and thanks for being here.
And I would just add to Liz and Andrew can jump in if he likes. For our grant project, Energizing the Humanities in the San Joaquin Valley, we've had a number of literary scholars that have participated. And so there's an incredibly rich literary tradition, right, of agricultural migration. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz.
We still have another question from Linda Hinojosa. She says, as a member of an institution of higher education, how can this rich history be included in the now mandated ethnic studies? And I presume that maybe they're referencing some of the new ethnic studies requirements that you're seeing in California. I don't know if you have any opinions on that, Eladio, being from Kentucky.
Can you restate the question? I'm not sure I've heard those.
Sure. So in California, anyway, there's been a movement for doing ethnic studies, a new requirement, say at the CSU system. You're seeing some of this at the high school level. I'm not sure to what extent you're seeing ethnic studies curricular movements, in Kentucky, but just wondering if you have, an opinion about, how we can leverage this moment with the growth of ethnic studies, right? How to get these histories in more, especially to young people.
Sure. Yeah. I have a couple of ideas. So first of all, yeah, it's different everywhere. And some kind of systems have a way of making this more integrated across their entire system. At Kentucky, schools are more or less autonomous. We're doing pretty good work here, I think, at UK of mandating that students take certain courses, at least that they at some point experience or come across these discussions. How to integrate them? Well, I think, like anything, with what we do, especially as historians. And I'm sure I realize that there are a lot of folks here who are not historians. There's always a way to talk about these things in complex ways. There's always a way to bring in these discussions. When someone says, for example, that, I don't do gender history, or I don't do immigration history. So, I mean, that's this cop out, right? Because everything is about gender, everything is about race, everything is about class. There has to be a way to talk about all of these things, no matter what the larger topic is. I think one way to do that is just to be aware of the literature that's coming out, because there's always exciting work coming out. So I think just being aware of where these debates and discussions are going, or where they have been, and incorporating them into our classes is important. One thing that I started doing, if I understand the problem that you're dealing with correctly, is something that I'm familiar with, right? How do I, if I teach a class on I don't know, the broad 20th century, how do I fit in every angle? How do I talk about gender? How do I talk about race? How do I talk about class? How do I talk about disability? I do what I can to fit as many discussions as I can to the syllabus, but there's always something missing. So what I try to do is encourage students to read outside of what's required, and to spread the reading around, so that not everyone has to read the same 5 books, that different people read different books based on their experiences, on their identities, on what they're interested in learning, on what they don't know about and would like to. And I find that that's a little bit more work as an instructor, but it really pays off to be able to sort of let students go and teach them, this is the literature, let's go find something that you're interested in and bring it back to the classroom. That has done wonders for my teaching anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, Eladio. And I think you answered it, but just to clarify too, the person asking that question, I believe, came from the field of like K through 12, so I guess the concept is, and it's just, and you can react to this or not, it's like, what role do university professors play, right, in trying to, work with the K through 12 as they implement ethnic studies? I mean, even you participating in this project here, that's great that you're in Kentucky, but can still come and educate us about your own work,
Yes. So if I could just add, thank you for clarifying that. I don't think I understood the question very well, but one of the things that we're terrible at, both teachers and professors or college professors, is talking to one another. We don't have enough conversations, right? I don't know what's being taught in a 5th grade history class or a classroom that's dealing with history. And I don't know that too many teachers know what I'm teaching, this next semester, or what anybody's teaching in this department. So I think we need to have better conversations. And again, I mentioned at the beginning that we've gotten pretty good at finding silver linings during this pandemic. I think one of the really cool things we can do now is bring in speakers, bring in folks to talk to our students who otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get into our classrooms. I've done that a lot with my own classes, and I think that's important to do. I'd love to talk to more teachers. Another thing that I would encourage is, I'm on social media way too much, and most of my content is terrible, but like just being on social media and engaging with teachers has been so fruitful for me, so that I can at least get a sense of the discussions, the problems that they have in the classroom, the kinds of things that that young people are learning or not learning as they make their way to college is hugely important. So I guess broadly, I would say conversations. We need to have better conversations. We need to have conversations, period, across different levels of education.
Yeah. Well, and there's other questions that I'm not going to pick on him, but Adam Sawyer, who is the director of the Liberal Studies program at CSU Bakersfield and trains teachers and builds those relationships. Him and I have these conversations, all the time. And we're trying to apply for grants to build that kind of rural learning capacity and to unite the levels. So, Adam, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. But in the meantime, there's a question from, I think, Jamie Bronstein. It says, do you think that the popular discourse about farm worker immigration, that immigrants, quote, do the hard work that Americans are not willing to do, unquote, undermines attempts to improve labor conditions for farm workers? So basically this idea that, well, it's the non-Americans doing it, so we don't care to reform or to improve labor conditions.
Such a great question. Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I think it does. The way we talk about labor, right? We talk about it as if it's beneath the dignity of Americans. And look, it's odd because we think of ourselves as an agrarian society, as having been started as an agrarian society, the kind of yeoman mythos of the United States. And certainly for a very long time, farm work and farm labor was not seen as being beneath the dignity or beneath the worth of an American citizen or a white person. White folks did that work just fine. Oliver, you've written about that migration, the earlier migration to California, and many others have. It wasn't like farm labor didn't exist before large numbers of Mexican immigrants came. So the way we talk about it, I think, can be dangerous. I think a better way of talking about it is lifting up those conditions, right? That those conditions are manufactured. That it doesn't have to be undignified work. That it doesn't have to be cruel work. It's always been difficult, right? But it doesn't have to be cruel. I've spoken with white people who used to do farm work, and they, like many immigrants who've had sort of better conditions in different times and places, talk about how even that kind of work can be even fun. It can be exciting. It can be fulfilling. So yeah, I think the way we talk about farm labor is problematic, and I was talking about this with other folks, and also suggesting that the way we talk about like walls too is problematic. When we say like walls don't work, we're kind of focusing on the wrong thing. Walls sometimes do work to tremendous effect. I mean, there have been thousands of deaths on the border because of the way walls have functioned. So I'm getting away from the original question here, but yeah, it's absolutely true, Jamie. I think it's important to really think about how we speak and write about labor conditions, and when we say it's work that Americans won't do, well, they won't do it because it's a kind of manufactured condition, because it's paid so poorly, because it's structured so cruelly. And so, yeah, the people who end up doing this work are often poor, sometimes desperate migrant workers or immigrant workers who don't have a ton of choices. But it doesn't have to be the way that they shouldn't have to work in those conditions. No one should have to work in those conditions. The work needs to be done, but it can be done humanely.
No, thank you, Eladio. Well, there's still 67 people in the room, so I'm impressed. This is amazing, Eladio. Just as we kind of wind down here, I think we've gotten to most of the questions in the chat and the Q&A, but I wanted to ask you about your book project. I know that maybe you could just talk a little bit about what we can expect to see in the coming years with that publication, and maybe, I don't know, future projects that you're already kind of manifesting.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't really have an answer about timeline, Oliver. I wish I did. The pandemic has thrown everything into even more disarray, right? And then I recently had a beautiful child.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So he's sort of taking up the bulk of my emotional availability, but I do have a deadline, right? That's supposed to be pretty hard. So first draft in the next few months, and then we'll see how that goes. But yeah, the project that I'm working on, the larger manuscript, is under contract with the University of Illinois Press, so expect to see it from them, I don't know, in the next 2 or 3 years, hopefully. The project is a history of the immigrants' rights movement, told through the kinds of debates that took place among Mexican Americans. I started in 1953 with that pamphlet I showed midway through the presentation, What Price, What Bags, which took a very hard line against the undocumented. And then I moved through really the present to talk about how that has changed. And certainly today, most Mexican Americans, most Latinos, period, are pro-immigrant. And so I tell the story of that transition, about how that happened. And part of the story, one of the chapters actually deals with the UFW. And what I try to do in that chapter is not sort of rehash some of the debates that have already taken place, and or talk about the kind of history itself of what happened with the UFW and the undocumented, because again, other people have done that already very well. But to kind of talk about how that changed debates among Mexican Americans, how that whole debacle forced Mexican Americans to really talk about this and to come up with a unified position, which you do sort of see by the 70s. So it's a story of immigrants' rights, of the immigrants' rights movement and how it came to be, told through the lens and through the eyes of Mexican Americans and their shifting attitudes.
And will you agree in front of all these people to come back to Bakersfield when your book is out to present?
Are you kidding? Absolutely, of course. Anytime I get to come to Delano and Bakersfield, I'm there.
Well, we'll take you on a little tour of the Central Valley when we have a hard copy for you to sign. And Delano, as somebody said. I just have one final question, Eladio, and this is really being, I guess praiseworthy of you, because when I first met you, right, you were just in graduate school and you've done so well for yourself. But one of the things that's been so impressive to me is your ability to engage the public sphere. I've seen you on news outlets. I've seen you write a number of op-eds, and there's some great scholars in the room who I'm sure we would all benefit from, your skill set. So I'm just, what advice or, could you share about, engaging the public sphere in the ways that you have very successfully so far?
Oh, well, thank you. I don't know how successful, but it's something I enjoy doing. I enjoy speaking to the public and to policymakers and to people outside of academia. For me, the trick is to translate. So to take the work that we already do as scholars and to simplify it, to make it more accessible, to tweak the language, and generally to make it shorter, right? Because we're long-winded to write very long, complicated things. And so I think for people who are interested in doing that, it doesn't take as much time as you would think if you kind of work on that skill, which is just take what you've already written. You don't have to start from scratch. Take what you already know, what you've already written, and condense it, simplify some of the language. It also, I think, makes us better writers. It allows us to explain our concepts or ideas or arguments more clearly if we are forced to talk to everyday people. So for me, that's the key. It doesn't always work, but it's worked pretty well so far. Just sort of taking what I already do as a matter of kind of professional discipline, and then just translating it into different formats.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Eladio, and we'll definitely link to some of your resources on our grant page. I want to thank everybody for being here, and this has been a long week for us at Bakersfield College as part of this Jess Nieto Memorial Conference programming. And for those who are still left in the session, this was being recorded. And again, if you want to go back and share it with your students, especially if you're a professor and you teach in agricultural rural communities, please, we want to make sure that folks know about Eladio's ongoing work. But again, we want to thank you, Eladio, so much for being here. And we look forward to, again, as I said, inviting you back when your book is out in hard copy, and we can do a little Valley tour, getting folks to their hands on it.
I look forward to that. I miss you guys, and I miss you all, in the Central Valley, and thank you all for everything you've done to put this together. Oliver, Andrew, Abel, thank you. And thank you everyone who came and heard me talk for a few minutes. I really appreciate all of you being here. So thank you all.
Thank you again, Eladio. Andrew, are we missing anything for closing announcements?
No, I think we're good.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for being here. Enjoy your weekend. Have a lovely spring break.